Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you're part of our journey. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and get ready for a story that will leave you thinking. And if you love inspiring tales, a like goes a long way. We need to keep this brief. There's barely anyone here anyway. Those cruel words sliced through the empty church as Mrs. Callahan's shoulders trembled uncontrollably. Her son had died defending his country, and now his final goodbye was being rushed. She clutched the folded flag to her chest, tears falling silently onto the crisp blue fabric, each drop a testament to both grief and loneliness. The provincial church stood nearly empty, sunlight filtering through stained glass onto vacant pews. Mrs. Callahan sat alone in the front row, her wrinkled hands clutching the folded flag. Behind her, a bored funeral attendant checked his watch repeatedly while the priest shuffled papers, clearly impatient. The coffin, draped in the American flag, seemed to highlight the absence of those who should have been there, honoring a fallen soldier's sacrifice. The priest cleared his throat, preparing to rush through the service. Given the circumstances, we'll abbreviate today's ceremony. Mrs. Callahan's heart sank further. At that moment, movement at the back of the church caught her eye. A man in a dark suit slipped quietly into the last pew. As the priest began speaking, the stranger's eyes, filled with genuine respect, met hers across the empty space between them. If this moment made you feel something, imagine what's coming next. Hit that like button and stay with us. Subscribe now. Mrs. Eleanor Callahan had prepared herself for many things. The military chaplain at her door 6 weeks ago, the official letter of condolence, even the weight of the folded flag in her arthritic hands. But she hadn't prepared for this final indignity. Her son, Michael's funeral, attended by no one. The morning had dawned clear and bright, mocking her grief with its beauty. She'd arrived early, hoping perhaps some of Michael's friends would come. As minutes stretched into a half hour, the reality became clear. No one was coming. The priest had suggested they move things along, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone with better places to be. Eleanor clutched the program with Michael's photo, his proud smile in uniform, eyes bright with purpose. The funeral director checked his phone, sighing audibly. "We have another service at noon," he whispered to the priest, not quietly enough. Eleanor heard every word, each one cutting deeper than the last. Her son had written to her about comrades who promised to attend if anything happened to him. Where were they now? The cold emptiness of the church seemed to amplify her solitude. The funeral director's assistant took a call, his hushed conversation about lunch plans floating disrespectfully through the sacred space. Eleanor closed her eyes, fighting back a fresh wave of tears. When she opened her eyes again, she sensed a shift in the church's atmosphere. The stranger who had slipped in earlier sat perfectly still, his presence somehow filling the emptiness around him. There was something familiar about him, but grief had clouded Eleanor's mind. The priest began the service with perfunctory words, his monotone voice betraying his disinterest. "We gather to remember Michael Callahan, who served his country." The words felt hollow, without an audience to receive them. Eleanor's shoulders hunched further with each passing moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, the man in the back row stood and moved forward several pews, as if drawn by an invisible thread of respect. In the shifting light, Eleanor caught a glimpse of his face and recognized him instantly. Things are about to take a turn. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe, like our video, and keep watching. Keanu Reeves. Eleanor blinked twice, certain her grief was causing hallucinations. But the man remained, his features unmistakable, even as he kept his eyes respectfully lowered. The funeral director noticed, too, his posture suddenly straightening, the phone disappearing into his pocket. The priest faltered mid-sentence, his rhythm broken by the quiet yet magnetic presence that had entered their midst. "As I was saying," he continued with renewed attention, "Michael Callahan served with distinction." Eleanor watched as Keanu moved forward again, this time to a pew just 3 rows behind her. He sat with quiet dignity, his focus entirely on the service, on Michael's photo, on the flag-draped coffin. Unlike the others, his reverence wasn't performed. It emanated from him naturally, filling the empty church with something profound. The funeral director whispered urgently to his assistant, who was staring open-mouthed at their unexpected attendee. The priest, suddenly aware of the celebrity presence, added flourishes to his previously abbreviated remarks. "Michael's bravery and sacrifice deserve our utmost respect and remembrance," he proclaimed with newfound enthusiasm. Eleanor felt a complex emotion rising within her, gratitude mixed with bitterness at how quickly the tone had changed. The funeral director now stood at attention, all thoughts of rushing forgotten. When the moment came for personal memories to be shared, silence fell heavy across the church. Eleanor's heart sank. There was no one to speak for her son. The priest cleared his throat awkwardly, ready to move forward when a gentle voice broke the silence. "May I?" Keanu Reeves had risen from his seat. The priest, momentarily stunned, nodded quickly. Eleanor turned, tears blurring her vision, as the actor walked slowly toward the front of the church. He stopped beside Michael's photo, studying it with genuine interest before turning to face her. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, his voice carrying a gentle weight that seemed to hold the entire room. "I didn't know your son personally." His honesty was refreshing amidst the morning's pretense. "I was in town filming when I read about Michael in the local paper." He gestured to the photograph. "About his service, his sacrifice." Eleanor noticed his hands. They trembled slightly. This wasn't an act. The article mentioned today's service. It also mentioned he had no remaining family except his mother. His eyes held hers with unexpected depth. No one should say goodbye alone. The funeral director and priest exchanged glances, shame creeping across their features. The assistant stopped filming surreptitiously with his phone, lowering it as Keanu continued. The paper described Michael as selfless, someone who believed in protecting others. That kind of courage. He paused, emotion catching in his throat. That deserves to be honored properly, with dignity and time. His words hung in the air, a quiet rebuke to those who'd been rushing through the ceremony moments before. This story is only getting deeper. What would you do in this situation? Comment below, and let's talk. Keanu stepped closer to Eleanor, his presence bringing an unexpected comfort. "Your son's sacrifice matters, Mrs. Callahan. It matters deeply." His voice carried through the church without effort, authentic and clear. "This morning, I called the base where Michael was stationed." Eleanor looked up, surprised. "They told me about Operation Shepherd's Shield, where your son saved 3 fellow soldiers." This was news to Eleanor. Michael had been modest about his service, the details classified. They described his quick thinking under fire, his refusal to leave anyone behind. Tears formed in Keanu's eyes as he spoke, mirroring Eleanor's own. The commanding officer said Michael could have retreated to safety, but he went back. The priest stood motionless, his earlier impatience transformed to rapt attention. The funeral director's face had drained of color, the weight of his disrespect now fully apparent to him. Keanu turned to address the nearly empty church, his voice taking on a quiet power. "In my life, I've played heroes on screen. But true heroism isn't found in movies. It's found in choices like Michael's." He gestured toward the coffin with profound respect. Real courage doesn't need an audience. It acts because it's right, not because anyone's watching. The pointed message wasn't lost on those present. Eleanor felt something shifting inside her, the crushing weight of loneliness lifting slightly. Keanu reached into his jacket and removed 3 sealed envelopes. These arrived at my hotel this morning. They're from the soldiers Michael saved. He handed them gently to Eleanor. They couldn't be here. 2 are still recovering, 1 redeployed. But they wanted you to know that they live every day honoring your son's sacrifice. Eleanor's hands trembled as she accepted the letters. The church doors opened quietly, and 3 uniformed military officers entered, moving with solemn purpose toward the front. The officers positioned themselves beside Michael's coffin, standing at perfect attention. The lead officer spoke clearly. "We're here representing Michael's unit. We apologize for our late arrival." He glanced at Keanu with subtle gratitude before addressing Eleanor directly. "Your son saved my life, ma'am, and these men's as well." The church's atmosphere had transformed completely. Where minutes earlier there had been rushed indifference, now there was profound reverence. Keanu stepped back, allowing the military men their moment, his own fame fading appropriately into the background. The priest, thoroughly chastened, approached Eleanor. "Mrs. Callahan, I believe we should conduct the full honors service your son deserves. With your permission, I'd like to begin again." Eleanor nodded through her tears. The funeral director, phone completely forgotten, arranged additional chairs as more people began to filter in. Local veterans who'd heard about the service, hospital staff where Michael had once volunteered, neighbors arriving late but arriving nonetheless. What had begun as a lonely farewell was becoming a proper tribute, all because one person had chosen to stand for respect when others wouldn't. It's not over yet. The best part is coming. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. As the proper service concluded, Eleanor found herself surrounded by people sharing stories of Michael, stories she'd never heard. The officer explained how her son had created a reading program for local children during his last deployment. A nurse described how he'd visited wounded soldiers when on leave. Throughout it all, Keanu remained quietly present, never seeking attention yet somehow anchoring the gathering with his sincerity. When the final prayers were said and the military performed the flag ceremony with precise, heartfelt movements, Eleanor felt a profound shift. Her son's farewell had transformed from an exercise in loneliness to a celebration of a life of service. As people began to disperse, Keanu approached her again, his expression gentle. "Mrs. Callahan, I hope I didn't overstep," he said quietly, away from prying ears or cameras. Eleanor shook her head, words momentarily beyond her. "Your presence meant everything," she finally managed. "May I walk with you?" he asked, offering his arm with simple dignity. As they moved slowly toward the church doors, he spoke about loss, his own experiences with grief that few knew about. There was no performance in his words, just human connection. The funeral director attempted to approach, perhaps seeking a photo or autograph, but was intercepted by one of the military officers. Outside, sunlight bathed the small crowd now gathered. Eleanor was surprised to see several news vehicles parked at a respectful distance. "They followed me here," Keanu explained apologetically. "But they've stayed back as requested." Before they parted, Keanu pressed something into Eleanor's hand, a card with his personal contact information. "For when the quiet returns," he said simply. What had begun as a hollow ceremony had become something sacred, not because of celebrity, but because of genuine respect. In the days that followed, the story spread across social media, not as celebrity gossip, but as a reminder of what true honor looks like. The funeral director issued a public apology for his initial treatment of the service. The priest established an annual memorial for fallen soldiers. But for Eleanor, the most meaningful outcome wasn't the public response. It was reading the letters from those her son had saved, knowing his life had mattered profoundly. And occasionally, when the grief grew too heavy, receiving a thoughtful message from a kind man who had understood that sometimes the most powerful act isn't saving the world on screen. It's simply showing up when it matters most. Wow, what a story! If this moved you, imagine what else we have for you. Hit that like button, drop a comment, and let us know what you think.